Well, my next interview in this series is with Martin Stewart Weeks, who I think, Martin, you're in Australia, are you?
I am indeed in
Yes.
Sydney town. Yeah.
Okay. Well, greetings from a rather gloomy, dull London, and we're not in the least bit envious. So please don't tell us how good the weather is.
Sun is shining. Don't worry.
It's always shining in Australia. This is a fantastic report, and your chapter, I think, is probably at the heart of the whole report. And it's how health will be experienced in the future. Now, the one thing I've learned about predicting the future is it comes quicker than you think, and you're generally wrong. But what I really would like you to talk about, well, first of all, tell us, what you was really trying to achieve with the chapter, which is self-evident. But tell us a bit about that, and then there's a couple of specific things I'd really like to talk to you about. So give us an overview of your chapter.
Okay. Sure. So I think the idea behind the chapter, and obviously we had a couple of co-authors working with me, clearly at the UK end, was to try and do a couple of things. I think one is to very much take on this notion that when you're talking about the future, the frame that you need to talk about is not the frame of can we think about, amazing technologies that are going to come along and all the rest of it, which we do talk about, obviously, in the chapter, but to use the experience lens, the idea of saying, it's not that we want to predict the future, but we want to predict the way in which health might be experienced in the future, which is a very different question, and one that I think has a couple of implications. The first is that it takes your mind off the potential trends themselves, and secondly, it says, what matters about these predictions is, as you said earlier, not actually whether they're right or wrong, but the extent to which making them or thinking them through opens up conversations about the way in which health will be experienced by the people ultimately, presumably, that we're all concerned about, which is patients and families and all the rest of it. So that's what we were trying to do. We weren't trying to be too sort of gee whiz about it. In fact, when I think back about the conversations, it wasn't like we were busy having all sorts of weird conversations about technologies no one never heard of, and we weren't sort of doing any of that kind of H.G. Wells kind of stuff. It was much more about that will date me considerably, but never mind. It was much more about
some people listening who will remember who he is.
Indeed, good old H.G. Wells. I'm very struck by a line that I once picked up some years ago in some Peter Drucker stuff that I was reading, and he said, the trouble is we spend all this time and energy trying to predict the future, and it's almost useless. What you should do is spend much more time looking right under your nose at developments and trends and movements that are already afoot and in whose development the future, in a sense, is already ready to play out. So in other words, it's not that you need to go and predict, you just need to have a bloody good look, frankly, right around you, like literally where you're standing, and you'll suddenly see a whole bunch of developments which in the next 10, 20, 30 years will start creating that future. And I think he's right. I think that's kind of what we tried to do.
Yes, because you do a sort of layering of how change happens. And you talk about fashion and art, and then you go to commerce, infrastructure, governance, and so on, regulation. And I mean, that is interesting, isn't it? Because if we were to take the example of, say, what we're doing now, using mobile phone technology essentially to talk to each other at the other side of the world, we take this for granted. But there's a huge row going on here about the role of this technology in the future of healthcare. Can we use it to talk to doctors? Can they do it on the phone, or like this instead of face to face?
Yes, exactly.
We got a big row going on here about a company called Babylon that I don't know if you're across, but they're using.
I know a little bit about them.
Yeah. And of course, the big thing about it is, Martin, that the public just love it. I mean, they've got 30,000, 40,000 people who've signed up. They've kind of broken the system with this technology. The public are saying, this is terrific. Of course, I want to do this. And the regulators and everybody else are saying, whoa, hold on a minute. Let's think about this. How do we do the reimbursement? How do we do the governance? So what you've written in this report is absolutely right on the money. It's spookily good.
Yeah. Look, it's a very interesting reflection, and that work that we picked up from Stuart Brand and his team around this idea of the the long clock and all that, the clock of the long now, whatever he calls it. It's fascinating, this idea about the different pace at which different layers of the change process work. And in my experience, having spent rather too long than I care to admit, and it's well over 30 years now, paddling around the public innovation and change in public policy, I think the big challenges we keep facing are challenges where bits of the change process want to move faster at different layers and other bits need to move slower. That's Stuart Brand's point, is that those lower layers, the institutional, the cultural, and nature, as he calls it, they're designed to move slowly. That's the whole point, because they give us that sense of stability and that sense of predictability. And yet increasingly, particularly churned up by digital technology, that fashion and commerce layer at the top is moving at breakneck speed. So it seems to me, and I had a long chat with Dame Sally about this and some of the other members of the team as we were working this chapter up, one of the most important challenges, I think, for public innovators and people who are running the public policy shop, as it were, in which all this change is happening, is how do you manage the conflict and the friction between those different paces, between the different rhythms of those change? Because if you don't, you're going to have a very, very bumpy and uncomfortable ride, because people who are engaged in those different layers, if they don't learn how to understand and align themselves with the different rates at which the other layers have to move, you're going to become very frustrated. You're going to become very annoyed. And it's possible that some of the big innovations and changes you want to bring in will actually go by the wayside because we can't work out how to align the big underlying shifts, institutions, infrastructure, and so on, with the sort of froth and bubble that tends to go on up at the top. And that's a big issue. And you're dead right. The problem is the public, and let's put ourselves in this, we're all the same. I mean, look at us now, as you say, we're all using this wonderful technology. We love the froth and bubble. We think it's great. We'd love more of it, quicker, faster, give me more gadgets. And what we often don't, I think, as consumers recognize is that there is a sort of a substructure, kind of iceberg effect, right? That's the tip of the iceberg. Down the bottom, this much, much slower stuff is absolutely critical, right? Because if you don't get that stuff right, all this fashion and commerce stuff will come to nothing and won't have the impact on what you're trying to do with consumers.
Exactly right. And we're having big problems with that here now with the Care Quality Commission, which is our regulator here.
Yeah, I'm a bit aware of that, yeah.
They're trying to figure out how they regulate apps and how they regulate the conversation that goes on, how they regulate artificial intelligence, which you talk about in this excellent chapter. And if you think about it, okay, so artificial intelligence may make a mistake, but we'll know about it. We can fix it, learn from it, and they'll never make the same mistake again. A doctor, even the best of doctors, general practitioners behind the closed doors of general practice, make a mistake. We never know. He or she never know. Or if they do, they fix it, and we still never know. So there is a debate to be had, isn't there, about risk, I suppose. Is that
completely
put it?
Oh, huge. And it's a topic about which I've had something to say and do over my last couple of years' work here in New South Wales, in Australia, where we've been looking at regulatory policy more generally across the public sector. And I was involved in a committee and we did some research on it. Two things that I'd say. The first is your observation about AI is really interesting. And it reminds me of that great sort of paradox that we've all learned to live with, which is that the technology disrupts, and yet the same technology is part of the response to the disruption. So it's really an interesting closed loop in a way, because just as all these digital tools and platforms are causing all this havoc, they can also turn around and actually help you to manage the havoc. And I think from a regulator's point of view, the second thing I'd say is that what regulators have to understand is that they're dealing with a bunch of technologies where to some extent the answer to some of the regulatory conundrums that these technologies throw up is actually in the technology. In other words, the technology is slightly, and we've got to be a bit careful about not being too Pollyanna-ish about this, it's sort of self-correcting, it's self-learning. So the idea that somehow you've got a bunch of technologies for which we now need some sort of external third-party regulator to come in and say, all right, now we've got to find out a way to stop these things going rogue. You've got to have a slightly different conversation as a regulator. I'm not saying you don't need the regulatory framework, but you need now to harness the self-learning and self-correcting capabilities of the very technologies you are now in danger, if you're not careful, of actually stopping. I mean, this is a great risk, right? And I think from memory, we do deal with this to some extent in the chapter. We've got to be a bit careful, right? Because these are technologies that are potent forces for very, very powerful shifts good shifts of power and accountability and transparency for customers. So if we start regulating the hell out of these things, which often means stopping them, or in effect stopping them, that's not going to help either.
No.
So regulators have to have a slightly different instinct, and they have to start to get to know the dynamics and the way in which these new technologies work. Does that make sense? So regulators can't just say, oh, well, this is just like any other threat that we've ever had, whether it's pollution or, big trucks on the road or seatbelts or something. It's not. It's not like any other threat.
And it's
because it's also its own solution.
It's also the regulator's ability to recruit and employ people who have the full understanding of those technologies.
Totally. Exactly.
Because the innovators don't generally make their way into bureaucratic places, do they?
They don't. Exactly. And people who are on these exactly what you've said, you've made the point very well. I couldn't agree more. It's a dilemma, though. And to be frank, as a former public servant, one can't help feeling a certain amount of kind of sympathy, I guess. It's a tough gig, I think, if you're a conscientious regulator and you know full well that the regulatory framework is important. It's not like we can chuck it away, which I think some technologists think you can, right? So I'm not taking this conversation down to that extreme. I think it's actually quite a tough gig for regulators to work out how they temper their regulatory instincts, which tend to be often very interventionist, very, let's stop things, let's try and constrain things, to actually a new instinct which says, well, first of all, we've got to understand the rhythm and the dynamics of this new technology so that we actually, as regulators, might be able to harness the very technologies we're trying to regulate to do some of the regulation. If that beginning to sound a little bit sort of circular, but you get my point.
And how we can be encouraging about them as well.
Exactly, and I think we have to be, because
otherwise innovation
we'll lose out.
It's too difficult. I'll go and
exactly.
work
No, that's not helpful. Because as you say, consumers are going to drive this. They're going to drive this to some extent.
Martin, we've come against the buffers of time. I only get 12 minutes to do these interviews.
Well done. We've done well.
We're on 12 minutes. No, you've done extremely well. You've covered the ground. It's a fantastic chapter. Thank you so much for finding the time to talk to us. And when you're in the UK, come and look us up.